So when we last left off, we had just completed going through a pretty detailed look at Azure Resource Manager templates. Now, there are some more sophisticated things that you can do, but we got into pretty much everything that as a regular DevOps engineer or developer or architect you might be doing with Azure Resource Manager templates, typically referred to as ARM templates. So today what we're going to do is we're going to go through a new technology that Microsoft has invented that simplifies the process of creating ARM templates, but really simplifies the overall process of just deploying resources into Azure. And this technology is referred to as Bicep. According to Microsoft and the founders of the Bicep product and project, Bicep is a domain-specific language for deploying Azure resources declaratively. It aims to drastically simplify the authoring experience with a cleaner syntax, improved type safety, and better support for modularity and code reuse. Bicep is a transparent abstraction over ARM and ARM templates, which means anything that can be done in an ARM template can be done in Bicep, outside of temporary known limitations. All resource types, API versions, and properties that are valid in ARM templates are equally valid in Bicep on day one. Note, even if Bicep warns that type information is not available for a resource, it can still be deployed. Bicep code, and this is important, is transpiled to standard ARM template JSON files, which effectively treats the ARM template as an intermediate language. So that's Bicep for you. That's the design around it and the thought process in creating a Bicep language. And when we start playing around with it, you will find that for the basic ARM template creation, Bicep is honestly a godsend. So why don't we go ahead and get started? And we're going to get started. I'm actually going to show you how to set this up for Visual Studio Code. At the moment, at the time of this video, Bicep language support did not exist in Visual Studio, the professional version 2022, the full-blown Visual Studio. But at the moment, it does exist in Visual Studio Code. So I'm going to use Visual Studio Code so we can get that experience and I don't have to do a lot of typing. So to enable that capability, you essentially need to go into the extensions and just type Bicep, right? And it should come up and you can install it. I would also recommend installing C# and whatever else it is that you need for your overall workflow. But it's as simple as that to get Bicep set up. Then of course, once it's set up, we're just gonna get going, create a new project. I'm sorry, not create a new project, create a new file. We're just gonna get going, create a new file, and select the language, and we're gonna go over here and pick Bicep, okay? So once we do that, we have our Bicep application locked and loaded, ready to go. So let's look at a couple of things that we did in the previous video where we talked about ARM templates. Let's actually put ARM templates side by side with Bicep and let's see what the differences are. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create another file. And this time, it's going to be an Azure Resource Manager template. There we go, close that there. And so over here, I've got my Bicep file. Let's go ahead and call it sample.bicep. And over here, we have my Azure ARM template file. And I'm going to call this sample.json. Here we go. Now I'm going to copy over some stuff that's from a normal JSON file. So what I'm copying over here is essentially let's get rid of this. It's essentially an ARM template that takes a parameter and essentially returns that same parameter as a string on an output. And we've already worked on this before, right? So we saw this in the last example. So let's go ahead and let's just run this. Let's open up a terminal, right? And if you recall, in order to run one of these, you typically do a new Azure resource deployment. So let's go ahead and do that. New AZ resource deployment. Resource group deployment. Okay, there we go. And we give a name to our deployment. And we specify the resource group. Here we're going to say RG2, the same resource group we've been using. And then finally, we need to specify a template file. Okay. And our template file is going to be sample.json. And as we discussed in the last video, when there's a parameter in the ARM template, that same parameter has to be available and passed in the executable that's being run, the PowerShell that's being run, that's triggering the actual ARM template. And there's two ways that this can happen. One of them is that you can pass it as a parameter. So I can say test here. Test, I'm going to say, just hit enter right now. There we go. The result is back. It's completed. The name of our variable for our output variable was completed. So that's why that's there. Hello world. And if you recall, we can also use variables, right? And variables allow us to manipulate the parameters that are coming into the program so that we have well-defined names. There's some string interpolation that are used to name the things that are being created by the actual resource manager runtime. So to create a variable, just set up a variable section. Of course, we need our commas. And ARM is because it's JSON, it's pretty straightforward, not too complicated. Okay, let's say our variable name is input. Okay. And what is the value of input? The value of input is parameters. And here we're going to put test. And we're actually going to concatenate it with something else. So we're going to use concat. And because we're concatenating it, obviously we need that. And then the final piece, this is fine, but this is not going to work. Why is it not going to work? Because if you recall, you have to use square brackets to enclose any sort of computation or manipulation at runtime of the actual data of the ARM template. Like the programming stuff has to be inside of square brackets. So I'm gonna put it inside of square brackets. And there you go. Now it's gonna pull parameter test and it's gonna concatenate that. You can see there's already an error showing up, right? It's gonna concatenate that with, let's say, let's actually make that the first one. So it's almost like a prompt program. So I'm gonna go here. You said with a space. That's it. And so now we have our variable set up. So for us to use the variable, we basically do the same thing that we did before, continue to do. So we call the variables function, and we basically pass in the input, and we're done. So if I run this now, there you go. You said hello world. That's how it goes. So let's try to recreate this with Bicep so we can see what the differences are, and why Bicep sorry, is kind of a cool programming language, right? So the first thing we're going to do, and I'm going to essentially just do a one-to-one mapping to sort of like illustrate what the features are in Bicep that correspond to the features that we discussed and that we're comfortable with now in ARM. Right, so the first thing is parameters. Well, how do you do parameters in Bicep? Because as we just said, there's really feature parity between Bicep. They're essentially the same thing, right? Just a different layer on top that makes it easier to express the capabilities that already exist. So to create parameters in Bicep, you don't use the parameters keyword as you see as it's used in JSON. You actually use param, right? So one thing about Bicep that's a little bit different from JSON is that, that's a little bit different from ARM templates, is that Bicep follows more closely the flow of a programming language, the structure to a certain extent. It doesn't flow like a programming language, so you're not going to, it's not procedural. It's still declarative, and there's really still no definitive ordering. It's not that there's no definitive ordering. It's that the ordering is not dictated by the order of items. It's not like how it is in a very, very basic program. And yes, for all the nerds and geeks and programmers out there, I am aware that programs themselves also don't necessarily, especially C# programs, at least C++ programs, don't exactly follow a top to the bottom flow either. There are structures that allow it to branch in interesting ways. But in general, we're just saying that this sort of figures a lot of that out for you without you having to worry about it. Getting back to the point, to create a parameter, you essentially use the param keyword and you say what the parameter name is going to be. So in this case, it's going to be test. You say the variable of the parameter. So over on the right side, we're doing the same thing, but we're using JSON notation to specify it. Over here on the left side, we don't have to. We're using a custom language format to essentially specify the same thing, right? And that's how you create a parameter. Now, how do you create a variable? You just use var. So this is another keyword. So when you put the var keyword, you can give it a name. And in the case of variables, you do not have to specify the type name. But as you can see here on the right, you also don't specify the type name for variables. So one of the things that's happened here is that we have an example of the variable calling a parameter. So how does that happen? How do we access test over here, right? So can we do this? As you can see, no, we cannot, right? So it's actually far simpler than that. So when you want to reference a variable or use a variable's value or parameters value, you just reference it almost like you would do, and this is going to look a lot like C++, C# and the C tree of products, JavaScript test, right? So this is essentially assigning the value of test to input. Now, Bicep also allows you to do string interpolation, but it does it much better than what you're gonna get with JSON and ARM templates with all this concat, and it's just a total mess. It's hard to figure out what the intent is. So over here, you can do the same thing. First of all, you have to put it inside of quotes, because it's going to be a string that's being created. Secondly, to do the actual interpolation, you basically use the dollar keyword and then the open and close curly brackets. This says that test is going to be the value of test is going to be embedded here. So then over here on the left of that, we can just simply say you said, right? Maybe this time put a colon, you said test, right? So this is the functional equivalent of all of this. As you can see, and as you're starting to see, the moral of the story and the general theme here is that Bicep is a lot less verbose than ARM templates. So so far, I've got 2 lines of code, and the equivalent in Bicep is basically all of that, these 2 lines of code, not counting all the scaffolding, because again, I haven't specified any of that either. So the final thing is the output, right? And so to create an output, once again, you just use the word output, give it a name. So we're going to call this output completed, just like we did on the JSON side. And we have to give it a type name. As you can see here, outputs require type names to be defined for them. So we have to do the same thing. So this is a string, and then we need to reference the variable. And this is how it's done in ARM. And over here, all we have to do is basically just say equals input, right? So on the left side with Bicep, 3 lines of code. On the right side with ARM templates, 19 lines of code. And this disparity gets bigger and bigger and bigger as we start having more variables, more linkages between things, more complex types, like being able to, use options and, and things of that nature, or required values. And then, of course, adding resources and how do you reference resources gets more complicated, more verbose. Referencing resources within resources, major problem. So let's run this and see how this integrates with a normal process of just deploying applications to the cloud. So I'm not actually going to change anything. I'm just going to go back to the same thing. And the only thing I'm going to modify is I'm going to remove JSON and I'm going to put Bicep. And I'm going to hit enter. So that's only one of the cool things about Bicep, and there's many, and I won't go over all of them in this video. But another cool thing that you can do with Bicep is that you can actually transpile your code back and forth between ARM and Bicep, right? So when you convert an ARM template into Bicep, it's called decompiling, and obviously compiling would be taking the the Bicep file and basically creating an ARM template from it. So let's go ahead and let's try and do that. And to help with doing that, we're actually going to look at the Bicep compiler. and look at some of the features, what it has, and see how it works. So all you gotta do is type bicep -- help, hit enter, and there you go. So as you can see, to build, you say bicep build, and you give the bicep file, and it will generate an ARM template. So let's try that. Bicep build. Bicep. Well, I don't want to create a JSON file, so let's see if there's a way to actually, there we go. So see. Wow. Okay. So what we're doing here is we're going to run this command, bicep build. It's going to compile this bicep file that I have in this folder, and it's going to create an ARM template called sample.gen.json. There we go. And we can DRR to see if that works. And there it is, sample.gen.json. And let's go back here. And we're going to open that file. Okay. Now let's move it over here. And as you can see, sample.gen.json is essentially the same as the sample.json. A couple of differences here, really over here, instead of doing a concat, they actually use the string interpolation function. So they use format, which allows you a little bit more flexibility if you're going to be combining more than one thing together into a complex, I guess, string. It's faster. So that's what I did with JSON. With Bicep in the previous section, I basically interpolated you said into whatever. So over here, it's a little bit easier. Over here, obviously, if like if there's tons of things, then I'm essentially concatenating things one by one. It can kind of be hard to visualize what's happening. So let's do the opposite now. So we've now created a JSON file from Bicep. Let's do the opposite. And to do the opposite, looking here, basically, you do, well, let's run it again so we can see. Move this up a bit. And there it is right there. So Bicep, decompile, and then you add the options that you want to decompile. And of course, as you can see, the output directory, the output file, and whatnot, and then you enter the file. So interestingly enough, up here for the Bicep build, I had my options after, and over here it's showing the options after, but it's kind of the documentation sort of says that the options should come before the file that you're creating. In any case, let's go ahead and let's try to decompile sample.json. So Bicep decompile sample.json. And out file, I believe it's called, equals sample gen.bicep. Enter. And it's just a warning to say that, hey man, this is the best effort. Don't say that don't sue us. So let's open this up and see how that file looks. There we go. So here's our original file, test, input, completed, and this is essentially the same minus the spaces. So why would someone want to do this, compile or decompile? Well, to decompile, I think we can sort of like grasp it. There's a lot of content out there. There's a lot of JSON files, ARM templates out there. And if you are going to switch over to being a bicep shop, fully doing bicep, then you just decompile all the JSON into bicep, make the adjustments as needed, and you're ready to go. Going from bicep to JSON is kind of similar. It's not about them being a lot of bicep files out there. It's about there being, at least at this point, technologies which have been built to require ARM, or have been built to parse ARM. They haven't been built to parse bicep, right? So you're still getting into environments, as we're seeing with this demo, where bicep will not work, right? So we're still seeing instances, as with this demo and using Visual Studio 2022 to do all my editing of the bicep files. There's simply no language service set up for that, even though there are language services for ARM, and it's about as good an experience as you can get, for basically editing JSON, right? So just during this fledgling period, where there's still limitations here and there, you're not going to have full fidelity bicep, meaning you're not going to have it everywhere that you go. So you still have to use ARM in some instances. And in those instances, you can just decompile the bicep and then copy and paste it, or import it into whatever tool it is that you are using. So the final thing that you can do with this is you can add resources. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add basically a website to this and see if we can run this and actually have it build and install into the website, right? So to do that, I'm going to change this to, say, site name. Okay. And oops. Maybe I just call this name. Okay. Then going through the resources, this is really the nicest part. You just type resource. You give that resource a name. So we're going to be creating a website. So the first thing we need to do is we need an app service plan for the website. When you hit space, it's going to bring you into this drop down where it has all the Azure resources that you're interested in. So I can just type server farm. Right. And then you put the version in right after that. And I always use the newest version. And you do an equal sign. And in here, you basically set up the properties of that JSON object that you would have been setting up previously, right? So the first is the name. I'm going to change this. We don't need this, right? So change this to name. Dot. And maybe I'm going to use the resource group. So you remember resource group from before? Well, it still works, right? Put a dash here. Okay. So now the site name is essentially going to be, or let's call it the base name, because we're not just having a site. So base name. So base name is automatically going to have that, right? And so over here, we can do the same thing, because we're going to have to do some more concatenation. So on the base name, I'll give it a name first, ASP. We'll call it the base name, and the location will be the resource group location. So as you can see, this same resource group function that I'm calling here is the same resource group function that I was calling from ARM, right? And all these functions are available, right? So over here is concat, so I can still use the same concat that I previously couldn't use. And there's format. Essentially, they're one and the same. So next thing I need to be able to build an app service plan is I need the SKU for the app service plan, right? So SKU is going to be S1, right? So I want an S1 server. And that's basically it. This should be able to create me an app service plan. So the next thing I need to do after creating the app service plan is I need to have an App Insights endpoint for it because I want to be able to monitor this site to know when things are going right or wrong or what have you. So again, it's very simple. Resource, I'm going to call it App Insights with the name, and I think it's Microsoft. I'm going to type Insights. Here we go. And oh, sorry for the confusion there. So right now, as you can see, there's a little red mark under here now that it's all finished. And that's because for some of these resources, there are required properties that they have to have in order for it to make sense to have them. And for App Insights, the required properties are the kind, location, and name. Now, when you go here, I can actually click Quick Fix, and it will add all the required resources, and that can get me going. So in terms of kind, go with web. Location is the same location as everything, resource group, that location. And the name, we can call it whatever we want. So I'm going to call it Insights. And then base name. Okay, so that should be fine now. Now that we have our app service plan and App Insights for monitoring, the next thing we want to do is we want to actually add the website resource. So same thing, resource, website deployment, and then this is going to be sites latest as well, equals add all my required properties. My name is going to be sites dash $ base name. My location, oh, I'm just going to copy it from here. My location is going to be the resource group location. I don't need that. My properties. In there, I'm actually going to add a couple of things. The first thing is that I need my properties because I need to combine, somehow connect this deployment to this and to that. And that's sort of the purpose of this exercise. How do you do that, right? First thing you're going to have to do is, just like everything else is referenced, this also is something that you reference. So there's a server farm ID. That's the ID of the server farm. Remember that an app service plan is really a server farm. That's the type that it is. So the ID of that server farm is what we're going to provide here. And easiest way to provide that is just to say ASP deployment.id, and you're done. And then let's configure the site now. And inside the site configuring, we're going to use configure our app settings. Now, why am I doing this? Because when you create a site and you want to connect, there's a bunch of ways to do it, but if you really want to connect app insights to your website, one simple and easy way to do it is just to add the app insights instrumentation key and give it the name app insights instrumentation key to the app settings for your website. So that's actually what we're doing here. So I'm going to go in here and type name. And I'm going to give it the name app insights underscore key. And for a value, I'm going to use my app insights deployment, right? And I'm going to be looking for the properties of this. Providers, properties, and pardon the noise. And then from the properties, I'm now going to get the instrumentation key. I have something wrong here. This is an array of objects, of name value pair objects to dictionary. So that's why that was causing problems there. Properties, there you go. And that's it. So we've essentially created a website in Azure. And it was this easy to do. So let's run this now and let's see what happens. Now, I know that there's going to be some errors, but I want you to understand what's going on and why the errors are happening. Give the file a name. Okay, so you can see here it's saying that the comparison failed, valid cannot be null, property must be specified. So what's going on there? Well, you've got to have properties for some of these items, even though they don't necessarily say that or an error is not being generated yet. There's actually an error right there. So let's go ahead and let's add the properties section here. And within the properties section, let's actually add the application type, which is also going to be a web type. And then let's run this again. So this is looking for a name. So let's call it Harrison. Do the same, no, comparison, sorry. Taking its time. And there we go. So look at that. We're all set. Now let's see if this actually got built. We call it comparison. So we're going to bring this over here. And we are going to go to the resource group. And we are in RG2. And here we go. Here's the insights for comparison. Here's the app service plan for comparison. It should be. Yeah, there we go. The one up top, comparison. And then here's the website for comparison. We go into the website and we go over to app insights. It should say app insights is linked through instrumentation key and app settings, which is what we did. Let's still turn it on, but it'll keep using that. And so this is all set up. If there was actually, let's go over here to configuration. Oh, gotta save that. And then let's go to app settings. And as you can see over there, we have app settings, app insights, instrumentation key, which has the actual instrumentation key. So that's been a basic look at Bicep. Hopefully you understand the power and beauty of this language and how it relates to the overall Microsoft, I guess, infrastructure as a service, DSL style language stack, which starts at the bottom, almost like as an intermediate language, as they say, with Azure Resource Manager templates, and then goes one step up with Bicep. If you like the content, like and subscribe, share with others, and we will see you in the next one.